Generally I use quite small brushes when I'm working. I've never got to grips with large ones. I've seen a lot of painters use very large ones to move it around. I mean, I suppose everyone's different, but personally this works for me. I think the one I'm using at the moment is size 1. I find with a smaller brush I'm able to manipulate the paint, use it to draw with, a bit like a pencil I suppose. And the largest size is probably a 2 or a 3. I might try in the future to use some larger ones and hopefully film those. This one I'm using at the moment, I think it's size 2, and it's a filbert. I use long round ones, or generally I was going to say long handles, and there I am with a short handle sable brush. That's probably the only one I'd use. It's generally for detail, but sometimes I think I was struggling with this bit, how to modelling the form. So I've just reached for that. I don't tend to use flat ones, but I have bought some. So in the next film, I'm probably going to be using those. And yeah, I think I'm going to definitely try and use some larger ones. And as I'm working, I'm just drifting around. The colour that I might have mixed might be appropriate for another part of the portrait, so I can just move across. It looks quite random. It's been a strange experience actually watching myself paint, because I've never seen it before until about a month ago, and it looks just completely random, but I'm always sort of looking at the reference and just seeing what needs to be developed. With the first glaze, my palette's generally quite limited, and I mean, you can see the way the colours that are being mixed on the palette. It's very it's just all hovering around the sort of base of alizarin and cadmium red. I mean, here in this portrait anyway. And there's a lot of scope to be much more adventurous, and later it really depends on the portrait, but here these are the sort of predominant colours that I'm going to be using, and I will develop them further on. And I'm talking from actually having nearly finished the painting now. Looking back, there's a lot more colour that went into areas of the cheek and around the forehead, and that just happened later as because it's never ending really. You can go further and further with it. The colours are fairly muted, I suppose, also because my background is as a sculptor, and so my primary discipline was always drawing first. You can see some examples of my stone carving on my website. I was doing before my most recent portraits and learning how to do grisaille. I was carving portraits in marble, and that was a brilliant discipline for drawing, because you can't make any mistakes. I mean, that's just why it's a joy to be working with grisaille at the moment, because I always have an opportunity to go back over the painting, and I can take paint off if it doesn't work. But with the stone carving, it was such a pressure, because one false move and suddenly it's all gone. So it really helped me to learn to look and look again. And with a sculpture, it's like 1,000 drawings, 1,000,000 drawings as you look all the way around a form. And I was working from photos, so I just had these sort of references, but just trying to sort of bring it all together in a carved portrait was a real challenge, because I wasn't using a pointing machine or anything. because I've never been taught to use that. But I had a pair of calipers. Some I worked with photos, some I did actually make a clay model and I would use calipers and transfer it. But when I was just working with photos, I would take a couple of caliper measurements, so I'd have a sort of rough gauge, and then the rest was all just sort of from various angle shots that I took around someone's head, and then it was all just a process of just looking and looking again, and seeing how the portrait worked in the round. But basically I just love drawing, and so the palette's quite muted. It's more than anything I'm focusing on the drawing. When the drawing's done and the tones are correct, then you can change everything with a very, very thin glaze. If I wanted to cool everything down, I could just put a really, really thin coat of glaze of blue over. I think that was how Bouguereau worked. I've seen photos of some of his glazes. He had his own formula, so I don't know how he made them, but some of them are peeled off, and so you could see that it's just incredible how he would just go over and do it. The craftsmanship is superb. He'd just glaze over the skin to create that depth, that coolness of the skin tone that his portraits have. I'm just giving my brush a clean. I'm generally a bit lazy about that, and sometimes I think it showed it earlier, I'll just sort of clean it on the palette just with if it's dark, if it's got some darker paint, I'll just keep adding a little bit of white and going through it, but it needed a clean. I use Zest It, which is made from oranges. It's just like a alternative to white spirit, because white spirit makes me feel a bit sick. And then after I've washed it and zest it, I'll give it a wipe and then dip it into the medium and just make sure I'm not just putting more white spirit into the mix, or more zest it rather. So soak it in medium, just dip it in, and then wipe that off as well. I don't want the brush to be filled with thinner at this stage, because that's the principle of fat over lean. You're not supposed to be adding a very thinned down oil paint with turpentine or whatever in the later stages of a painting. That happens at the beginning, and then it's oil is the medium, or in my case I'm using walnut oil with an alkyd to help it dry quicker. Trying to create a bit more warmth in the cheeks at this stage. In later glazes there was a lot more going on as well, but I don't want to rush things. there's always going to be time later to add more, and so easily as well. Just the thinnest coat of glaze can just change everything. So I am trying to model the glaze as it goes on as well, but possibly the brush I'm using is a little bit too rigid and a little bit small. So yeah, it's just a little bit more work to model the glaze. This is my homemade mahl stick or mahl stick, which is a piece of bamboo, which is just great at this stage for keeping a steady hand. If I've got to do some fine work here, I'm just painting around the nose and the nostrils, just trying to get the drawing right, because I don't think it was completely right first time around. It's also, as I said, it's just a slightly awkward angle with you know, the camera just over my shoulder, but anyway, this is fine. I just lean it usually against the top of the canvas on the easel, and it's just enough to keep a steady hand. In the first glaze I will try and model everything as much as I can, but I can always just let it dry and then I'll work into it again later with another glaze. Sometimes you can only go so far, I've found, or you just end up overworking it, or you can just mess it up. The crucial thing, as I've said before, is just not to cover the original grisaille. Not to, if you just destroy it, then you might as well never have done it. And it looks just so random watching myself paint, but I'm just constantly looking at the reference and seeing what needs to be done and so I do flick about a lot, so just moving straight on from the nose onto the eyebrow, just constantly seeing things that need to be corrected or changed to have a little bit of colour added. I have just bought some Rosemary and Co brushes, some long rounds, and they're very, very small. There's even a sort of size 2-0, which I've used on another portrait, or actually on this portrait, but in a later glaze. And so I'll show you. You know, I'm looking forward to using those filming because they're really lovely to use. I think this size 1 brush, it's a long round hog's hair, is possibly my favourite brush to be using just for the sort of finer areas, because at the moment I don't want to get too bogged down in the details, but it still allows me to just focus on much smaller and finer areas. I guess I like hog's hair because just painting a portrait, the human face is just so subtle, and just the tiniest change can completely alter the mood of a portrait and the mood of a person's face that I'm trying to capture. But possibly with a hog's hair, it has a softness that leaves it open, and obviously that still applies. The moods can change, and the life and the character of a portrait can completely change with just the tiniest alteration. But it just gives it a little bit of space to breathe with a hog's hair. I can just so even using some of the really fine ones, as I said, the sort of 2-0 ones, they do capture very, very fine detail, but they still just leave it open. I'm not really one for really fine detail anyway, I must say, and that's enough for me if I can get close. Even just using this one, a number 1, a long round one, that's fine. Just making sure I've got a little bit of medium to work with. Obviously, as I said, I've oiled out the surface, so the surface has a sort of oily quality to it, not too much, but I also want to just help the paint slip, even more around. And I just thought that was a really lovely bit. Just picking out the highlight, it can just really sort of transform the 3 dimensions of the portrait. I'll dry brush it in a bit, or I'll use a larger brush. I'll just model it in, but I can just lay down highlights here and there and just leave them for later and just sort of feel my way through it. I'll use these larger brushes to model some of the transitions.